It was easier to get rich in the past. Prospectors, oil tycoons, and aviators didn't have to compete with hyper-rich multinational companies that dominate the world economy. They might like to pretend they are all self-made billionaires, but they could never compete with John D. Rockefeller. He came from nothing and counted every penny, including what he gave to the homeless. So the story goes. Yet his fortune is dwarfed by anyone in Forbes' top 10 rich list. They all got their start by capitalising on their privilege and inheritance. How are you supposed to amass generational wealth when you're already up against generational wealth? Some of the biggest companies are family run. If they are not in name, then they are in hierarchy. But their hoard of wealth isn't as secure as you'd think. $1 billion doesn't stretch so far these days. By the time he died in 1937, Rockefeller's net worth was 1.5% of America's total economic output. So even though Musk and Bezos have overtaken Rockefeller's wealth, he was still in a better position to make sure his lineage never had to worry about money again. So why did his fortune disappear? It must be drying up because the Rockefeller name doesn't dominate the Forbes rich list. No doubt some of the 75 descendants went on a spending spree or two, but with some working in finance, you'd think it wouldn't have vanished so quickly. His grandson was CEO and chairman of Chase Bank Manhattan. If there's one family member whose job it is to count the pennies, it's this guy. So where has the fortune gone? Luxury lifestyle? Philanthropy? Their pivot to the finance sector and real estate investments suggests a move into acquiring assets and businesses. The fortune may still be strong, but a web of trust funds and shell company masks it. Or, perhaps, their valuable assets have incurred so much debt that the Rockefellers are now house poor. If his fortune can dwindle, does that mean the super rich are stronger or weaker than we initially thought? To answer that, we need to know what John D. Rockefeller thinks, before he was known as a robber baron, for his, shall we say, mischievous and sometimes illegal business practices. Jonathan D. Rockefeller had a strict upbringing that sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie. He was born in 1839 to a savvy con artist father and a strict, frugal religious mother. John was raised to follow in his mother's religious footsteps. Still, his father's lust for money and other vices overshadowed her teachings. Though far from rich, they were not destitute. John D. Rockefeller would keep records of every penny he spent and was taught to give his church $3 for every 10 he earned. Bookkeeping was an obsession, which stemmed from his mother's strict work ethic. But he learned from his dad the hard way when it came to business matters. His father had a knack for making money through conning, gambling, and other chicanery. In fact, he once said he enjoyed teaching his children what it was like to be taken for a sucker. He got a kick from cheating them out of business and lending them money at ridiculous interest rates. His argument was that it made them sharp and helped them protect themselves. Eventually, his father turned his back on his family to run off with different women, which left young John to bear the burden of being the man of the house. He had to abandon his dream of college, narrowing his opportunities even more. By the time John was 16, he'd taken an accounting job for a local business. Here, he discovered that his employer's calculations were miscounting pennies. What seemed like a non-issue to most was ultimately a lesson in compounding wealth. If there's one thing that sums up the Rockefeller path to success, it's compounding. Years later, this would become pivotal in Rockefeller outsmarting his competitors during the oil boom, but it is worth remembering society's attitude to money. Being new money wasn't cool. In modern times, we love the underdog. We love to see someone make something of themselves. Back then, social standing was tied to inheritance. It was all about generational wealth. Anyone who went into industry was sneered at. Making money wasn't as respected as inheriting money. That's because old money stemmed from nobility, so being rich didn't carry power and influence unless you had the pedigree to back it up. A millionaire from old money carried more social value than a billionaire from industry. Nowadays, it's the opposite. John D. Rockefeller bridged that gap. Not only was his wealth generation from a new pioneering industry, but it fortified him against the Great Depression so that he'd redefine what it meant to be a self-made billionaire when he emerged victorious. He didn't have the handouts and leg-ups that the modern super-rich have. Still, the fact his fortune has dwindled suggests you're better off breaking even than trying to leave a fortune behind. It's time to learn how history works as we follow the rise and fall of the Rockefeller family. After a few successful grain investments and some steady accounting work, John D. Rockefeller pivoted into oil. It was the 1860s, and the crude black liquid was the new thing, according to oil tycoons at least. It wasn't near the hot commodity it would become over the next 100 years. Metals like steel were the primary manufacturing material. Consumer plastics were still in their infancy. This made oil the late 19th century's version of getting into reading about blockchain technology while paying AOL for a dial-up connection. So jumping into this new industry was a risk, especially as he didn't have a formal chemistry education or business background to fall back on. He knew it too. Rockefeller saw that he would be squeezed out of this developing market unless he secured an advantage over his competition. His eureka moment came when he realized that, regardless of the size of your oil drills or the number of barrels you produced, you still needed to refine your oil to sell it. So Rockefeller constructed the biggest oil refinery right next to a busy bridge in Pennsylvania. Funding such a move meant borrowing money from his father at a high rate of interest, of course. To some, this proves he wasn't a self-made man. But given the circumstances, and his dad's extortionate interest rates, this example may not be the same as that of other tycoons who got a head start in life. In any case, the risk paid off big time. Rockefeller was making money off his own competitors. They weren't concerned that he was taking a bit off the top to refine their oil because they would make dollars selling it. But Rockefeller knew the power of pennies. With every competitor relying on the same bridge, he was guaranteed to take a cut from every train coming through. His savvy business move generated enough capital for him to found Standard Oil on January 10th, 1870. Now that he had a stronger foothold in the industry, he stepped up his business tactics to secure his position. He must have memorized more lessons from his con artist father than he probably realized, because soon his behavior earned him a nickname, the Robber Baron. His playbook for a successful business meeting included making his competitors sweat until they realized he was right to offer them a buyout. Things really heated up when he conspired with the train companies. With his cohorts, they'd raise the rate of transportation costs for rivals and even misplace barrels if Rockefeller's business plans didn't go according to, well, plan. Gradually, competitors were undercut until the pennies compounded so much that Rockefeller could swoop in. These ruthless tactics were instrumental in Standard Oil's horizontal growth. In fact, expansion was so immense that his company controlled over 90% of US oil refining. This milestone helped him become the world's first billionaire in real time. That means his wealth wasn't retroactively adjusted for inflation. His claim to having $1 billion was legitimate then and there. And since he was, at least for a while, the only billionaire, he made sure his $1 billion stretched. He bought property, funded scientific research and political causes, and even bankrolled educational initiatives like the University of Chicago. Yet despite signing away checks and counting every penny, it hardly made a dent in his fortune. But you can't stay on top forever. Rockefeller was making a name for himself and had caught the attention of antitrust busters. Even if his conspiracy with the train barons was not fully uncovered then, his presence in the public eye couldn't go unnoticed. He could be seen giving money to children and was known to receive 50 letters a week from people begging for handouts. He also had a reputation for philanthropy, harking back to his early days sweeping the Baptist church. By the end of his life, John D. Rockefeller had given away around $500 million. Adjusting for modern inflation, that's around 10 to 15 billion. Rockefeller also donated to abolitionist and suffragette causes. Nowadays, such deeds wouldn't seem controversial, but they could raise eyebrows back then. Compound that with being new money and too successful, Rockefeller knew that his income would soon dry up. So, when the US government stepped in to break up his monopoly in 1911, Rockefeller had been considering ways to protect his fortune for some time. The irony is that the US government showed him how to do it. Splitting up his empire increased the share value. As you can imagine, Rockefeller held many shares in his own empire, so he ended up richer after his monopoly was broken up into different companies. When the Great Depression hit, he was still standing while his competitors were weakened or destroyed. But this entire saga proved that the real path to wealth wasn't in oil, but in finance. What's the point of making money if you have no way to protect it? In the same way pivoting into oil was risky, pivoting into finance was risky. So was his hand forced, or did he jump into it willingly? From this point on, the Rockefeller family turned to trusts, directorships, and financial managers to safeguard their wealth from income tax, capital gains tax, and anything else that might come their way. The days of generating wealth through oil were over. Yet this new strategy posed a big problem. How do you fund your protection if you're not making any income? Even after discounting broader economic factors like inflation and market fluctuations, it's only a matter of time until your trust fund runs dry. Statistically, the more generations that benefit from the same pool of finances, the more diluted each share will become. And that's before we factor in new overheads like divorces, remarriages, and redivorces. And with the economic changes during the 20th century, including the rise of progressive taxation, this would compound against the Rockefeller fortune even more. In addition, the Rockefellers aren't reinvesting, which means their bank account is running out like an hourglass with a hole in it. Of course, they're still richer than you or I, but given how Rockefeller's worth peaked at $336 billion, you'd think it would be stronger after 100 years. Now, the collective net worth is between 8 to 10 billion. Surely one member of the Rockefeller family has figured out how to top up the family fortune before the spawn rate outpaces the interest rate. Well, yes and no. The Rockefellers indeed have a legacy of philanthropy. He even funded the Rockefeller Center. Charity continues to be a consistent habit with his descendants. John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated thousands of acres to the Grand Teton National Park. In 2006, his son donated the family retreat to create the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Preserve. Other philanthropic endeavors include supporting and expanding US national parks, including the Grand Canyon and the Great Smoky Mountains. Fifth-generation Rockefellers have also initiated projects like turning abandoned gas stations into parks. There's also the family's support of historically black colleges and universities, not to mention the ongoing scientific research costs at the Rockefeller Foundation. They're also patrons of the arts. Abby Ulrich Rockefeller co-founded New York's Museum of Modern Art, plus John Jr. funded the restoration of the Palace of Versailles at the start of the century. All that is just the tip of the iceberg. So let's discount the argument about whether this was a PR move or the logical extension of their patriarch's Baptist upbringing, because it still eats away at their fortune. So with family members carrying the torch of philanthropy, a mathematician could deduce that the draining of funds was reaching terminal velocity. But then there's David Rockefeller, the grandson of the original robber baron. He passed away in 2017 at the age of 101, so it's fair to say he witnessed the biggest consequences of the old way of doing things. Instead of going into oil, he became chairman and CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank. He even became a figure in international diplomacy. However, given his legacy and employment, that has been met with some criticism. He was undoubtedly instrumental in tying up the fortune with different trusts, brokerage, and every other tool Wall Street has to offer. But the family's connection with high finance ended well with him. Besides, even if the family had invested their inheritance, the compound growth would have been much weaker than the stock market in which John D. Rockefeller operated. There are only two ways the Rockefellers can keep their generational wealth. The first is to turn to companies who specialize in just that. In other words, outsource it. These companies fuse business management with financial education to ensure that the family's children grow up ready to manage the financial side of things. This includes strategies on how to mitigate inheritance tax or even inherit defrauding. Signing everything over to the first son can sidestep those nasty sibling squabbles during the will reading, and it will give your dynasty a whiff of nobility. The transition from new money into old money is just a matter of survival. Who knew? However, relying on businesses catering to generational wealth seems redundant to some. Indeed, suppose you're from a multi-billionaire family. In that case, you already have a world-class education and more opportunities and privileges than paupers like us can ever imagine. If you still need help after that to make sure you don't buy any more Porsches or Miami penthouses on impulse, maybe your generational wealth was supposed to dry up. Thankfully, there's the second option: pivot. John D. Rockefeller pivoted from bookkeeping to oil refining when it was the riskiest move he could make. When the government came for his empire, he pivoted into the finance sector to play defense. The best way to maintain generational wealth isn't to retain it, but to reinvest it. Most of the names on Forbes' top 10 rich lists are guys from the tech world, which is still relatively new in human history. And the ones who aren't from Silicon Valley made their fortunes by pivoting outside of their chosen field, usually into finance. Of course, we can't know precisely how much of the Rockefeller fortune is left over. The series of interlocking private companies and trusts makes it impossible to know how much each owns and owes. For all we know, the Rockefeller fortune is breaking even because their interest in their holdings covers their overheads. They may be house poor, but the alternative is more likely. The Rockefellers are old money, but the world is run by new money. Names like Zuckerberg, Musk, and Bezos carry more power than Rockefeller. Any connections John D. forged during his time are long gone or obsolete. And even if the family did try to pivot, even by reinvesting, they would be outsmarted, outmanned, and outpriced. The real question isn't why did the Rockefeller fortune dry up? It's why didn't the Rockefeller fortune dry up sooner? The answer to that is obvious. They've been counting the pennies. If you liked this video, check out our one on family fortunes that outlived their families. Be sure to subscribe to keep learning how history works.